I will be talking about the problem-centered interview. It is a book that has been recently published with Sage. You can take a look at it afterwards, or you can also check it out at the Sage bookstand. And it's a method that has been developed already in the 1980s in Germany, and a colleague of mine, Andreas Witzel, is the author of it. And in 2012, 30 years later, we made an attempt to revise it, update it, and to put it into a wider audience and write it in English. So I understand that the slides will be available online. That also means that I put a lot more into it than I can actually handle within 20 minutes. That means I will skip things every now and then, but don't get scared about that. The goal is that I will take you to the end of this slide, that you come to understand the problem-centered interview as a qualitative, discursive, dialogic interview technique of collecting and reconstructing knowledge about relevant problems in the perspective of interview partners, respondents. And I hope that I will be able to address every aspect of this definition so that at the end you will understand what it is. It is a particular method of qualitative interviewing, and I'm very happy that Janet Holland did the presentation before me, because many things have been already addressed. Now, a little bit of background. The method was developed in the 1980s by Andreas Witzel in the context of a research project about occupational socialization of young people. And the starting point for this design was the status paradox of qualitative interviewing in the 1970s of Germany. So you have to think back a little bit. The qualitative interview got gradually recognized, but it remained underdeveloped. And as an alternative to available very asymmetrical ways of interviewing, and this is on the one hand the survey interview and on the other hand the narrative interview, the problem-centered interview was designed in order to solve some of the problems that these two extremes were bringing about. The structured survey interview, of course, was one that assumed that the interviewer would not produce any bias within the interview situation. And this is still valid. I mean, survey interviews still try to measure social reality without a bias. And this, of course, is a strange assumption if you think of things that were written, for instance, by symbolic interactions and ethnomethodology. And on the other hand, there were already then radical alternative qualitative methods available, like the narrative interview, that assumed if you don't intervene, if you manage to produce a very nice stimulus at the beginning of an interview, the person will talk for 1 or 2 hours and you will have the perfect data for your research question. And this was criticized as well because you can produce perfectly good data by really entering into a dialogue and conversation with the person. In order to develop the design of the problem-centered interview, for the updated version in the book, we asked ourselves a couple of questions that served as guiding questions. The first one is, what can we as interpretive researchers, of course qualitative interview researchers are meant in this case, what can we know about the social world? And the second set of questions addresses the design issue. How can we design our interview practices of knowledge collection and production according to this first question, without, on the one hand, neglecting available social scientific knowledge, so the things that we already know about the field, about the topic, without also inhibiting subjective perspectives. This is the task of qualitative research, to be open to what people have to say, and without also corrupting the chance to discover novel aspects of certain problems. So these are the guiding questions that I will now take as a backbone to illustrate the structure and the concept of the problem-centered interview. I will talk first about this first epistemological problem, then I will talk about the issue of prior knowledge, the things we know actually already. Then I will talk a little bit about the concept of the respondent, the researcher and the interview relationship, and then I will address probably one instead of two, there will not be enough time, as practical aspects of doing problem-centered interviews, and these are the communication strategies that are actually used. The first thing is we have to ask ourselves what is happening in an interview situation. And what is really happening is that a person who is essentially in this, on the right-hand side, the respondent, in the perspective of his or her practical knowledge, has a certain meaning attributed to topics, situations, and experiences. And as qualitative researchers, our goal is to reconstruct this meaning, to find out what this original meaning was. But epistemologically, it's not possible for us, as not being the person, the other person, to really arrive at this very authentic first level of meaning, but we will always stay on a second level of reconstructing the original meaning. This is a phenomenon that was, for instance, addressed by Alfred Schütz. He's an important key figure in interpretive sociology, and who essentially says that, I will not read it out all, but the end is, the constructs used by social scientists are, so to speak, constructs of the second degree, namely constructs of the constructs made by the actors on the social scene whose behavior the scientist observes. So we are operating as researchers on a second level of reconstructing what our respondents on the first level think about certain topics and situations. The important thing that we need to understand is that as researchers, we come not, metaphorically speaking, naked to this situation, but we are not only dressed, but we also bring a lot of prior knowledge to the research. And this is indicated here. So we have our own experiences related to the topic, and we know from research what issues are relevant when we talk about this certain topic. So what the interview is then really about is the confrontation not only of these two people, researcher and respondent, but it's also a confrontation between the practical knowledge of the respondent on one hand, and it can be an expert, because also experts dispose of practical knowledge. So practical knowledge on the one hand, and prior knowledge on the other hand when it comes to the researcher. This prior knowledge, I move a little bit forward to illustrate this. This prior knowledge that you have as a researcher can either be related to your own everyday experience, it can be related to the contextual knowledge that you have about the topic, and it also can be related to the research in the background of this knowledge. And the important thing is, and this relates a little bit to the lecture, to the keynote lecture that we just had, the important thing is that you use whatever prior knowledge you have in your interview and in your qualitative research in a sensitizing way. So you try to not pin down things that are relevant within the interview, but you try to develop a general interest, a general direction of interest and attention in the qualitative interview that you are doing. The point behind is that all of our knowledge is in a sociological way embedded knowledge. So in analogy to the embeddedness of the individual lives in social structure and social realities, also our knowledge that we have and that we bring to an interview situation is already always to some extent available in advance. And the things that we essentially perceive and see in the interview are also things that are deeply rooted in the things that we bring to the situation. That means the prior knowledge we have is our research capital. The prior knowledge we have, it is articulated in research questions and research interests and so forth and so on, is also the reason why all research is biased. Yes, as soon as you articulate a research interest, you pick out certain things and you identify them as relevant, and others you don't look at. Prior knowledge is also a form of knowledge that cannot and should not be suspended. And then I go to the last point here. It is a good starting point for a hermeneutic process of revision of available knowledge and revision of knowledge that you bring to the interview situation yourselves. There's another slide about prior knowledge, which I skip now. And let me come to the second aspect. Now I'm addressing the question of how do we not suppress knowledge that is available. So the issue of openness in qualitative research. How do we make sure that the relevances of the people that we're talking to actually have a chance to come to the fore? And one of the things that we suggest is that we use a concept of the respondent that is empowering. That we say that the respondent is a comprehensively competent and self-reflective research partner who's essentially taking seriously in the whole research process. And that means, in practice, that we also invite the respondent already during the interview to participate in our process of interpretation. So the interview is a chance, at least to some extent, to clarify a couple of interpretations that we may have during the interview. So the interview or the interpretation is not the privilege of the researcher alone. Of course, you can continue doing interpretation afterwards, but you can also do some of it during the interview. The concept of the researcher, of course, is related to this issue of prior knowledge. So the researcher is a well-informed researcher. He's familiar with the things that are relevant in the field. He's also a researcher that is on the one hand actively listening, of course, like in every other qualitative interview. And he's a researcher that is also actively understanding. So he's using the situation of the interview to involve the respondent in a process of understanding and revising knowledge production. Ideally, that means that the researcher and the interviewer is the same person. This is, of course, not always possible, but that means that at least you have to train the interviewer very well in order to get the prior knowledge, so to say, working. The interview relationship then is one where the prior knowledge that you have as a researcher and the practical knowledge of the respondent enter into a corrective relationship. So a moment of control is dedicated over the interpretation is actually dedicated to the respondent. And the interview is a first chance for interactive interpretation and revision of some of the researcher's pre-interpretations. And pre-interpretations in the problem-centered interview are these preliminary interpretations that you develop in the course of the interview already. And this is why we say that PCI is a discursive dialogic reconstruction and validation of knowledge about problems. In a more challenging way, this first figure which I showed you can now be revised and complexified a little bit. You will also find it in the book. So the problem-centered interview is a dialogue, a discursive reconstruction of the problem. Prior knowledge of the researcher enters into a dialogue with the practical knowledge of the respondent, and the researcher obviously has in his mind, because he's a researcher and comes from a research background, embedded within a sensitizing frame of reference. The topic of research of our interest is termed problem in our technique, and this idea of problem centering has been cause for some misunderstanding, because some people say, okay, every interview is somehow focused, so why do you need to use a label that is nonsensical here because it's not distinctive. Problems are not to be understood in the sense of, difficulties or something like that, but it's more in the sense of Programmatic or Problemstellung in German and in the French context, that you actually try to identify a society problem with immediate practical relevance for the interview partner. For example, finding a job is a problem that involves people, or the threat of unemployment is a problem that involves people. And by means of these problems, you establish, because they are relevant for both sides, you establish an alliance between researcher and respondent and a common interest in making the joint conversation about this problem work. So this is an important part of choosing the topic that you're studying with problem-centered interviewing. And maybe the last point here, centering means that all your research efforts are actually focused on the reconstruction of meaning of all crucial aspects of the topic under research. And I will now in the following talk about communication strategies that you can use in order to deliver this focus of reconstruction. There are two more principles which I'm not going to discuss now. And I will also skip the part about the interview guide, because there's much very general about it, and I will instead come to talk about the communication strategies that are used in the doing process of problem-centered interviewing. So I said that the problem-centered interview is a dialogue between the knowledge of the researcher and the knowledge of the respondent. In other words, it's a dialogue between the prior knowledge that we have, including concepts and theories, and the everyday experience and practical knowledge, on the other hand, of the respondent. And in order to capture these two levels, in order to bring together these two dimensions of the dialogue, the problem-centered interview suggests two different sets of communication strategies. The first set is called communication strategies of general exploration, and they deal essentially with generating material, producing substance that you then can follow up. And this is also strongly related to what is usually associated with the active listening part. So you try to trigger monologues, you try to trigger accounts that produce material, and you try to facilitate this not only just by sitting back and listening, but also by intervening and carrying the interview dialogue, as I will show you in a minute. And the second set of communication strategies are strategies of specific exploration, and they generate comprehension. So they are really about producing, revising, and consolidating interpretation. So they are about the active understanding part of the problem-centered interview. And what you have is a combination of an attempt to produce breadth on the one hand, and on the other hand, depth of the interview. And here I have an overview of first the communication strategies of general exploration. And of course, some of this will be very familiar to you because they are used in many qualitative interviewing techniques. You can, of course, for instance, start with an opening question that triggers and generates a narrative. Then you can continue during the interview with detailing questions about certain things. You can ask for descriptions. You can also ask the respondent to elaborate on experiences. You can enter ad hoc questions that come to your mind that try to clarify things. And you can also involve the respondent in repeated thematic comparisons. All these strategies produce different types of text. You know the distinction between narrations, descriptions, and argumentations. And these strategies really produce all three sorts of types of text. And after or complementary to this general exploration, there are strategies of specific exploration that generate comprehension. And the most important techniques here, on the first of all, is the technique of mirroring. So you actually try to involve the respondent in a process of understanding. So you say something like, as far as understood, you meant this and that. Is that true? This is, in terms of interaction communication, an attempt of involving the participant, the research participant, in a process of interpretation. You can also ask comprehension questions that clarify things, and you can also do something that has to be done very carefully because it's a delicate strategy, and you can also use confrontations. You can also, if there is contradiction in the account, you can also try to figure out together with the respondent which of the two things that contradict with each other are actually valid and which are not. I also included, this is the pre-last slide, an overview of a flowchart of the PCI interactions. I mean, there's not enough time to go into this now, but you can see this later when you get the slides online, that you have different shares from interviewer and respondent that interact with each other. Like Janet Hollett said, it's a stepwise procedure that moves starting from one point to something like, ideally, as you can see on the bottom, a discursive dialogic reconstruction of knowledge about the problem, if it were that easy always. But I mean, this is the idea behind. And what I also included, and this is something that you find in the book and that actually structures the book, is a description of 3 different steps that are required in problem-centered interviewing. Partly they are, of course, also valid in other forms of qualitative interviewing in terms of preparation, interviewing, and processing. And the book is structured according to this outline. Thank you very much.